Hi everyone, it's Ren here, and in this video I will be talking about Nietzsche, and that would be the second part of my sort of little discussion on Nietzsche, and hopefully reaching a kind of conclusion on why I think that he is so influential, so important, so profound, rather than just shallow, edgelord, superficial, provocative, projecting his own sense of shame into idealizations of warlike warriors. Kind of a redundant thing to say, but anyway, who are proud and who are just the opposite of what he himself was. Like that, those are the sort of views of Nietzsche that I think are, to an extent, they are legit because he was projecting a lot of the time in his writings. But the point that I want to make is that even though he was projecting in his writings, and he has, this is what I want to insist on. Nietzsche has said a lot of bullshit. Okay, he has said bullshit. What he says about women, what he says about people who suffer from disabilities, like some of the things he says, like they are either ridiculous, childish, or like Russell says, they are projections from his own sense of shame, coming from the fact that he himself felt like he was very shy, very socially disabled, physically kind of disabled, by his constant migraines, needs to travel to Switzerland a lot of the time to take those health trips, and that if he sort of, so to speak, preaches a philosophy of the overman who's strong, who's in great health, who's proud, who despises humility, and who despises just the embrace of peace for the sake of peace. Well, there is that side to Nietzsche. So the point is not to say that doesn't exist in Nietzsche, because to argue that it's not there, that to deny it, is in my opinion, fallacious. It is dishonest, and I believe to be quite familiar with Nietzsche's body of work. I think the best way to defend Nietzsche is to begin by saying, yes, these things are, by and large, true to an extent. They might be exaggerated, they might be made worse, than they really are. But really, like, if you open a Nietzsche book, you might come across things like, that would come across like misogynistic, or again, like intolerant towards certain minorities. Like, it can happen in Nietzsche. It can happen. Of course, it would have to be slightly recontextualized, etc., but it can happen. So that's not where I think Nietzsche's real lasting influence lies. You might say, well, he's popular with like edgelords on the internet, or people who just want to be provocative for the sake of being provocative, because that's where they get their like antithesis sense of identity by opposing anything that is seen as acceptable. Comes from no, because if that were like if Nietzsche's influence had such shallow roots, then Nietzsche would not really exist anymore, because you have a lot of other people, much more recent people, who would speak to generations of our age, a younger age, that would be more accessible, more directly speaking to those audiences, and Nietzsche would not be needed. Nietzsche is not the only person who's come up with these ideas. So the reason why Nietzsche is influential, very influential, and I think very important, is much more profound. It's what lies, in a sense, behind those positions that is sort of not doing justice to those, not done justice to by those positions. And yet at the same time, there is a certain sense in which the positions that are outrageous and which I personally reject, and the source of the influence, are connected. But I'll be very careful in how I articulate that, okay? So basically, what I was saying in the previous video is that Nietzsche talks a lot about Christianity, critiques Christianity. From this develops his own revaluation of morality, what he calls that. And he has this whole concept of resentment. So I would like to keep those different concepts in mind. The herd morality, the herd, morality, as well as, what he calls like the overman, the aristocratic values, etc. Like, you might say, oh, like he's basically a proto right wing whatever philosopher, but that's not the case. He does seem to embrace, in his own valuation, he does seem to embrace a lot of the opposite of what Christian morality, to speak really of the Western world, seems to promote. So you'll see that Christian morality, well, you know that it tends to promote altruism, humility, a peaceable disposition, etc., etc. And you will see that in Nietzsche, usually the promotion is rather, instead of altruism, he promotes egotism. Instead of peaceable dispositions, he promotes, a warlike disposition, if that needs to be the case, if that is required. And he tends to promote much more pride and greatness versus humility. Okay. Of course, if you look at this superficially speaking, you might say, well, he is kind of a proto-edgelord, because what he's doing is essentially like picking what is commonly seen as like the acceptable or respectable system of norms with their clear delineations, and that we follow them. If we follow them, we are like we feel good about ourselves. If we don't follow them, we feel ashamed, we feel hurt. And he says, well, that's a disabling condition, to feel hurt by a sort of not feeling like one has disrespected a moral axiom, and that's what he wants to avoid. But you might say, well, he promotes these other attitudes. But by promoting these other attitudes, these other virtues, because his revaluation of values implies that what are certainly not virtues in like a system like Christian morality becomes virtues in a Nietzschean morality, like pride, etc. He says, well, at least those are not going to be virtues that are going to make you enfeebled, weakened. There's a great concern in Nietzsche's philosophy and his approach to ethics that is about promoting good health, expansion of one's will to power, since metaphysically speaking, he believes that human being, alongside other beings, is a will to power. We express our will to power in a different way than other beings do, but like the tendency of life to just expand, to just want always more, And he says human beings have that very much. And if there is a system of morality, it should be all about enhancing the individual, enhancing people, so that they can go as far as possible. And the number one thing that they should not feel is shame, is this enfeebling, like systems of norms, webs of norms that are around us that actually are tacitly oppressive, and whose oppression we feel when we don't respect them. They become very obvious, even though they're usually in the background, ingrained in our minds, And so Nietzsche says, what should qualify as a virtue? In the end, it's not so much about the virtue itself. It's about whether, it's about whether relating to it as, what you could consider a virtue, accepting it into one's own system, is not going to lead to fear of not respecting it, of weakening, at feeling shame at disrespecting it, or just feeling like never good enough, for example, never good enough at like being a good, a good Christian, or being good enough in terms of being altruistic, having a constant sense like we're not quite reaching our full potential, or feeling a certain guilt, which is best sort of embodied in the Christian morality of like eternal guilt towards God following original sin, right? Anything anything that is like, that smacks of that smell of like weakening, Nietzsche cannot stand. You might say it's a projection also of his own condition, and there's truth to that, but it's much more profound, because the idea that like those laws, those implicit norms that exist in the workplace, in the family, everywhere in society, like they are in a certain sense enfeebling. They if we don't fit, they can make us feel weak by making us feel ashamed, like we don't belong. But at the same time, respecting them scrupulously can also make us feel weaker by boxing us in a way, making us like everybody else. And so Nietzsche he doesn't want to say like embrace this system instead, right? Like his system, because he doesn't want people to be like sheep and to say, oh yeah, so I prefer that system of norms and embrace that system. No, what Nietzsche wants is the overman, the man who's able to follow his own template, to come up with his own, the one that is best suited for his own flourishing. And in the sense that it really is believing in the potential of human being, and believing in what human being is capable of for himself or herself or themselves, much more than the Christian would tend to think. Because the Christian, in a certain sense, you might say, with all their frameworks, they are suspicious about the ability of human being to promote their own flourishing. But Nietzsche goes further than that with this concept of resentment, because, and that is a hugely influential concept in Nietzsche, cannot be exaggerated how important the concept of resentment in Nietzsche is. He says in one of his books, I can't remember, I think it's The Gay Science, but I could be wrong, he says, nothing in man is more potent and everlasting than the passion of resentment. And in a sense, fundamentally, resentment qualifies what he calls the herd morality. So people who subscribe to a particular set, framework, a particular moral framework, in order to better single out those who do not respect them, usually because unconsciously or consciously but secretly, they feel jealous of the strength of these people not to respect the norms, to want to think for themselves. And that, like, a lot of the time, people will not even realize that. They'll just be like, oh yeah, like, that person doesn't respect it, how shocking, how immoral, how scandalous, and we will just feel like scandalized. What Nietzsche says is we'll feel scandalized because secretly we feel resentful, and our sense of scandal is only an external manifestation of a deep, profound sense of envy for these people. But having the frameworks and subscribing to them allows us to gloat together at the suffering of that person, that's a very strong, proud person who wants to create their own values and think for themselves, just how they suffer by being singled out, by being punished, by those who in fact are mostly happy about what's happening to that person because they themselves are weak and resentful of that person's freedom, of that person's will to power. And that's resentment, and that's what Nietzsche says about Christian morality. He says, if you look at it in detail, it was not created by God. It's not like an axiomatic product of a God entity. It was created by men. And what he cultivates, when he cultivates humility, peaceableness, what Nietzsche says is, yeah, of course, it promotes that because the people who are the sort of harbingers of that and who are the safeguards of that, the priests, and by priests he means the priest plus like a priest-like people, they tend to be weak. They tend to be like weak physically. They tend to be cowardly. They tend to be, all these different things that they're like very sort of envious, cowardly, weak people who devise together a system where the virtues that are promoted are precisely the virtues that are going to be easiest followed by those who are already weak, already envious, respect, like being altruistic or supposedly altruistic, being humble, being peaceable. Yeah, because they could not be otherwise. Whereas the people who have a lot of power, they're going to be struggling with that because sometimes their overwhelming expanse of power coming from themselves is going to come across as not these things. And so that is, not only is it better for the people who are already weak and are not capable in the first place, is better because it's easier for them to follow the path of humility, of etc. But it will be a perfect way for them to shame and weaken those who do not follow. And so there is power and politics mixed in there. Ethics, power, and politics come into the fold of that morality. There is resentment on the part of the weak. The herd together singles out and makes the others feel ashamed by acting as if they were the safeguard of a system of morals that in fact is either their own creation or the creation of those who are of the same caste and who came before them. And that the overman, the man who has respect for its own will to power and for the capability of that will to power of expanding constantly, is able to not only to question those systems, come up with his own, and resist, and get to a stage where resistance is not even really relevant anymore, because they will be already following their new path, their own new Bible. Nietzsche's own Bible is Those Pigs Zarathustra. It is the Nietzschean Bible, but it's his own. He's never going to tell you to subscribe to it as if, you were subscribing to a system like Christian morality. No shame involved. That is what he announces. The overman will look like this, like Zarathustra. But in the end, it's up to, every single person to make that effort to follow their own path. there you go. So I hope I made a decent case for Nietzsche, and I will be talking to you soon. See you guys.